Hello and welcome to the third and final webinar for the Young Pacific Leaders Small Grants Program. My name is Haley Clemson and I am the Assistant Program Officer on the Indo-Pacific Programs team at Cultural Vistas, supporting the Young Pacific Leaders programs. For those of you who may not have worked with Cultural Vistas previously, we're a nonprofit organization that specializes in international exchange and are the implementing partners for the YPL Small Grants Program, a program that's funded by the U.S. Department of State and made possible by the U.S. Department of State U.S. Mission to New Zealand. The YPL Small Grants Program is a program under the YPL Initiative, which is a youth leadership development initiative organized by the U.S. Department of State and began in 2018. So far, it's had 4 full iterations, and this will be the 5th. The YPL Small Grants Program is an opportunity for Young Pacific Leaders alumni aged 25 to 40 to apply for small grant funding up to $10,000 to implement innovative projects in the Pacific region related to the 4 core pillars of the YPL program. To help interested alumni prepare to apply for the YPL Small Grants Program, Cultural Vistas is hosting these preparation webinars to provide additional information for the program, as well as to support applicants in the application development process. The first webinar was focused on developing and submitting a grant proposal, and the second webinar focused on putting together a strong core project team. Each webinar was recorded and can be found at culturalvistas.org/YPL on the YPL Small Grants section of the website. The third webinar today is the third and final webinar before the application deadline, which will be on the 7th of January, 2024, and it's focused on budgeting. This webinar will help teams interested in submitting a proposal to better understand the budgeting process, review the budget template, and help answer any questions about what expenses can and cannot be included in project budgets. For those of you joining us live today, at the end of the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. Once we get to that section of the webinar, please raise your hand and we'll go to you for your question. You're also welcome to submit questions in the chat as we go along. I'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation as well. For those watching the recording, please email your questions directly to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you with those responses as soon as possible. The final recording will be uploaded to the YPL website at the beginning of next week for those of you who are unable to attend to be able to watch or rewatch to find any of the information that you learned. For those needing any additional accessibility resources, including access to the PowerPoint presentations or a PDF application, please feel free to reach out to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org at any time. Please note that our office will be closed for the holidays on the week of the 25th to the 29th of December, and any questions asked at this time may not get an immediate reply. However, we will answer your questions as soon as we're able to in the new year and before the application deadline. As a reminder, on screen is the outlined timeline for the YPL Small Grants Program. This is an important timeline to note and consider as you're preparing your small grants application and project implementation timeline. Being aware of the small grants implementation timeline is important for your project's development, as your project's timeline should match that of the program. This also connects back to our topic of today, which is budgeting, and how your budget actually aligns with your project's timeline as well. The most important date for the application timeline is the application deadline. This deadline is in a few weeks on the 7th of January, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand local time. As I shared, today's webinar is focused on preparing a small grants budget and how the budget factors into the project management. Creating a budget can be overwhelming, but it's a critical piece of applying for grant funding. The budget you submit in your application further explains the project idea laid out in the narrative by describing the items that will support the project implementation and help the team achieve the outlined project goals. If your project narrative is the why and the what, in many ways, the budget shows the how. To help, all budget information can be found on the YPL Small Grants website, which is culturalvistas.org/YPL/small grants program. And you can also find the necessary templates and information within your online application. When looking at the website, you can find this information under the How do I come up with a budget and the FAQs. You can also find it in your online application at the bottom under the supporting document submission. This will allow you to download a template that you can use for your project proposal. An important thing to note is that all applicants must use the provided budget template for your project budget and will need to submit it with the program application. If you're on the application and you scroll down to the supporting documents section, you will see that budget template in bold and linked. You can also open an Excel spreadsheet with the budget template for download from the online template that you see through the application. You can also please email yplgrants@culturalvistas.org if you're having any issues accessing this document from the application. Now I'll take a moment to look at that template itself. The budget template spreadsheet is modeled after costs generally associated with grant funding. Since the program is funded by the U.S. Department of State, at Cultural Vistas, we abide by all federal regulations outlined in the U.S. Department of State grant funding opportunities. This includes both the overall YPL grant programming as well as the individual small grants projects themselves. The guidelines that this program follows are typical guidelines found with other funder requirements for grant opportunities outside of YPL as well. When applying for grant funding, it's important to always check the budget requirements before applying. This ensures that you provide the correct information and do not request funding for something that cannot be covered, which could hurt your proposal. Going back to the items that we discussed in webinar number 1, it's very important to make sure that you include all requested and required items listed in the grant application. This applies for how you complete your budget as well. First, when completing this template, be sure to fill out the top section of the template so that we know what projects this budget is associated with. It will be a supporting document and not a physical part of your online application, so it's important that all of your supporting documents make it clear that they're connected back to your project proposal. Also, make sure that the information that you provide across all of your proposal documents and in your online application are consistent. Your project title should match the project title that you include in your application and all of the additional documents that you provide. Same with your budget totals and project currency. For the project location, you'll need to outline where the project is being implemented. If this is going to take place in multiple countries, please list each of those countries here. The total amount requested and the total cost share are two different things in the budget template. The total amount requested is the amount that you're requesting from the YPL Small Grants program. These funds are the total of what you are outlining in the sections at the bottom of this template. And this is the total amount of money that is being requested for your small grants project and has to specifically go to the project that you're outlining in your YPL Small Grants project proposal. The total cost share, however, outlines any funds that you may be receiving from other funders or partners. We have received questions from interested applicants about whether your project can have funding from other sources, and the answer is absolutely yes. For any type of grant funding, it's encouraged that you find opportunities to further fund or sustain your project, and this shows the sustainability of your project. For the YPL Small Grants Program, we do not need you to know the specific details of those funds, but do need you to include the total of other amounts of money or cost share that you have received for your project from other funders at this time. You'll list the total amount at the top of your budget, but should not outline any of the specific cost share line items in the remaining part of your budget. Again, demonstrating cost share is not required, but highlights the sustainability of a project if it does have funding outside of what you are requesting. As a reminder, for the 2024 YPL Small Grants Program, you can request up to $10,000 US. Projects may be conducted in the local currency of the project team or location. However, you need to be sure that when the amount is converted, it equals no more than $10,000 US. The total requested amount of funding and the currency being used for the proposed project needs to be consistent across all of your documents as well as within your budget. This means that the currency shown in line items in your budget should be the same as the currency for the total amount requested listed here at the top of your budget template. For the project budget, it's incredibly important that you only request the amount of small grants funds that you need based on your project proposal and budget research. You can request up to $10,000 US, but do not need to request the full amount of money. If you only need $3,000 to implement your project, then only apply for $3,000. You'll need to demonstrate that the money you receive for the project is being fully spent towards the project. If selected, you'll need to remain on target to spend the amount of funds that you requested in your budget for your project proposal. Therefore, it's important to ask only for the amount of funding that is needed. As your project proposal is reviewed, only feasible projects that outline clearly the connection to the requested funding amount and the project work plan and goals will be selected. One way to ensure that you're not requesting more than needed for the project is to request and search for quoted prices on the budgeted items that you are proposing. For example, if your project is a workshop in which travel to other Pacific locations is needed, providing a quote for the flights outlines the amount needed for each participating person to travel. And it ensures that your proposed amount is in line with the amount of money that you will need for that expense. Another example may be reaching out to any possible project venues needed for your project to get an estimate of renting that space out so that you have a better idea of what will be in line with that cost. The examples could go on, but the more you can get an accurate estimate of your project costs during your proposal development, the more accurately that you will be able to estimate your budget totals to keep in line with your project proposal work plan. These quoted items can be detailed in a budget narrative that would be included in the supporting documents section of the application. If providing this information makes your application stronger and helps clearly outline the project goals, we encourage you to include this. Back to the overall budget template. After the top portion on the background of your project is complete, you'll see the budget is broken up into 4 categories for item descriptions, being supplies, travel, personnel, and other. Each is set to guide you in thinking through and breaking down your project's costs. As previously mentioned, these 4 sections mirror a similar budget structure to other U.S. Department of State grants. This document helps to provide not only a budget template for this program, but also a learning resource that you can build off of for potential future funding opportunities that you may apply for. When compiling your budget, remember that budgets are meant to describe or list out what you will be spending money on for your project. In other words, each line needs to demonstrate the cost of what will be purchased to support your project. You do not have to fill out every line in the template, but try to make your budget as detailed as possible. In this top section, you'll also find a few instructions to remember as you're drafting your budget. Please be sure to read through the instruction section in full. You can see these instructions listed on the screen now. We'll touch on these instructions in more detail, but they include entering the item description for each budget item under the most appropriate category, entering the unit cost, the number of units for each item, and itemizing and describing items over $50, and remembering that you cannot exceed the $10,000 in your budget total. Now to the item description section. As mentioned, and as you can see here, the budget is broken into these 4 general categories of supplies, travel, personnel, and other. Supplies, what do you need to bring to make your project work? For example, if your project needs materials such as paper, pens, etc., this is where you would input those costs. This section may be pretty self-explanatory while compiling your budget. There's also travel. This will be any logistical travel costs for your project. Some examples may include a workshop where you're bringing together people from different Pacific countries to another location in the Pacific. Or if your project is in a rural location and you need to bring people from an urban area to the project location, so you'd like to include those transportation costs as well. Another example, if the project is an exchange, this could be the cost to bring participants for your project from one country to another country. And please note that travel within the Pacific region is the only travel that is fundable under this budget and its requirements. No travel outside of the eligible YPL program countries in the region is allowable for this program. Personnel. This is a less common expense and generally only included if you have to pay a professional to help implement the project, such as a trainer, facilitator, etc., with a workshop, for example. This could also be for professional services for items such as multimedia materials, website development, etc. And it's important to keep in mind that this is not, however, intended for salaries or overhead. Salaries and overhead are not allowed with this funding. One thing that could be placed in this topic is honorariums or speaking fees for a professional assisting with your project, which is not considered a salary, but more a gesture of thank you. The honorarium should not exceed $250 per speaker. And finally, the other category will include any costs that don't fall under the first 3 categories. Some examples may include hotel meeting space rental for a workshop, catering if you're hosting a meeting during lunch, any audio visual requirements, etc. If a budget line item doesn't seem to fall in the first 3 categories of the budget, then you can input it in the other category. Once you decide which category the expenses will go in, you'll need to include the item description of that expense. You then enter the item cost or the unit cost, which again can either be in US dollars or local currency, but should stay consistent throughout your budget. We do ask that you, again, please be sure to be uniform in this and use the same type of currency consistently for each line and across your budget. Otherwise, proposal reviewers may have many questions and lack clarity on your project's plan and budget, which would not help with the project's consideration for funding. The entire budget, again, should only be in one currency, either all US dollars or all the local currency of your choosing. Be sure to include the currency that you will be planning to use for your project at the bottom of this spreadsheet, as well as on the online application. Next, you'll enter the number of units for each item that you are listing. This will be the number of each item that you will need. For example, if you're ordering t-shirts for a workshop and the participants that are participating, then The number of units could be 27 t-shirts for each of those participants. The total line, shown in gray, will be automatically calculated with the unit cost and number of units. It's important to remember that all items over $50 must be itemized and described. Do not include lump sums of the cost without fully describing the anticipated expenses. This is where the information from the vendor quotes requested comes in handy to help ensure and outline the accuracy of your estimates. Finally, as the last point states in the instructions, budgets cannot exceed 10,000 US dollars. Successful funding requests will be at competitive rates and prove how costs directly relate to the project. The spreadsheet will automatically tally your project expenses inputted in the categories above. And before you upload your final budget in the application, please be sure to check two things. One, that each line item in the budget is calculated into the budget total. And two, that your final requested amount meets or is below the 10,000 US dollars. And don't forget to factor in exchange rates. For those planning to use a local currency rather than USD in your budget, there is not a set exchange rate that we use. And if you decide to use your local currency as the currency that you show in your budget, it's important to factor in the currency conversion rates used while developing your budget so that you do not exceed this allowable amount. For exchange rates, Cultural Vistas recommends the converter that I will show you now. This website offers a currency converter that can help you adjust currency as well as the date of that currency to get a good idea of exchange rates. This is helpful when trying to estimate cost conversion within your budget. If you need any support finding this tool while outlining or creating your budget, don't hesitate to email us and we're happy to provide you the link. However, it's awanda.com/currency converter. Back to the template. As a general practice, it's important to remember that your grant budgets, in your grant budgets, that you should try not to move money between budget categories when you're implementing your project. This further outlines why it's important to estimate the expenses that you foresee as close as possible to accurate in your proposed budget so that you're helping set up your project for success further down the line. As the budget template notes, you can reallocate money throughout implementation. We understand things come up and you can't predict your budget 100% accurately. However, you cannot move more than 20% of your budget between categories. Moving or reallocating money within your budget is not encouraged, but if necessary, should always be done with approval from the grant administrator. In this case, for the YPL Small Grants Program, that is Cultural Vistas. For those of you who are new to budget management, it's easiest to try and avoid reallocating funds this way. However, it can be allowable for minimal amounts as a contingency for extenuating circumstances that may occur. It's important in this circumstance that your team communicates this with the funder, being Cultural Vistas. As noted on the template, there are certain items that the YPL Small Grants Program funds cannot be used for. You can find this in the Remember section of the template. As a reminder, YPL Small Grants funds cannot be used to cover international airfare to or from the United States. The exception to this being unless you have a team member from Hawaii or an American affiliated Pacific territory and are conducting an exchange program, or if that team member needs to travel to a project location in the region. Also, staff salaries, overhead, and office rent. If you need a meeting space, funds can go towards a shared workspace, but cannot be used to justify a long-term lease. Unconnected, but on a similar note, if your project needs a subscription service for your project work plan, such as a Zoom subscription, for example, you may only budget for that subscription within the time period of implementation. Another thing that cannot be covered is large items of durable equipment. This is an area that we have received a few questions on. Large items of durable equipment are not usually funded, but a reasonable request for equipment may be made on a case-to-case basis. These items cannot be used for personal profit. An example would be a printer. If you can explain why it's needed and imperative for your project, that you are printing things that pertain to the work that you are completing, then this would be something that would be considered fundable. We would additionally ask that you consider the sustainability of any large item of durable equipment when making your project proposal. What would happen to this item, or what would it be used for after the six-month implementation period? If you have any questions about what items of durable equipment may be fundable or have exceptions be made for, please reach out to us via email and we can help answer any of those questions. Another thing that cannot be funded is excessive representational meals or entertainment. For example, something that would not be fundable is if you requested funds to host a gala dinner. As a note on this as well, you have to keep in mind that, as you may have noticed from past YPL events, all US government funds cannot be used for alcohol. Lastly, the funds cannot be used for academic research. This is not an academic grant. This is a project-focused grant looking for specific deliverables and outcomes, and therefore needs to show those specific deliverables and outcomes for your project. Lastly, partisan political activity. The funding cannot be used or applied to any government agencies or political activities. If you're not sure about whether you could put a specific expense to the grant given these items that cannot be funded, please email us and we'll clarify with you directly. That brings us to the end of the budget template review. And now we'll discuss managing the project and reporting on the money spent by your project team if selected. This is helpful information to note as you're developing your proposal, as it will impact how your budget is used throughout the grant period. As noted in the second webinar, the funding for the YPL Small Grants Program will be dispersed in 3 separate allotments. The project teams will be required to provide a report every month detailing their expenses, along with an update on how project implementation is going. To remind you, if selected to participate in the YPL Small Grants Program, the project treasurer will receive 60% of the funds for the project after the kickoff workshop in March. The project treasurer will then receive 35% of funds after submitting the required monthly reports and the midterm report. All reports must be submitted in order to receive the second allotment of funds. And finally, the project treasurer will receive the final 5% of project funds after submitting the final report and all outstanding monthly reports with the project results. It's important to think about project management as you're developing your project work plan and application submission, especially thinking through matching the expenses timeline to the funding disbursement timeline of the program. For example, if you know the majority of your project spending will occur upfront at the beginning of implementation, you'll need to think about how you'll offset the costs of those items that you cannot cover at that time, as you've only received 60% of the small grants funds upfront. At the kickoff workshop, we'll work with each selected project team closely to make sure that everyone understands the reporting requirements and how to track expenses, as well as what is possible during the budget management period. Following the kickoff workshop, Each team will receive that first 60% of funding that they requested. Selected teams will only be eligible to receive the funding that was approved in the initial proposal. So once you submit the budget figure for your project in the proposal application, that will be the budget that your project has to work with through the implementation and to the end of the program. The transfers of project funds will be sent as a bank transfer to the project treasurer, and Cultural Vistas will be covering the cost of any bank fees associated. However, if you have a project that will require you to move money between accounts after receiving the funds from us, you may want to consider adding a line in the other section of your project proposed budget for additional bank fees. Each month, project teams will submit a project report and will need to include a budget report along with a narrative. The budget report will demonstrate expenses for that last month, overall, and outline the remaining balance for each line item. This report will also need to include copies of all receipts and expenses from that month. These reports will be due on the last day of the month, New Zealand time, each month. More information will be provided about reporting to selected teams during the kickoff workshop. At the midpoint of the implementation period, there will be a midterm report, and that will ask for additional information and an analysis of how project implementation is going thus far. After the midterm report is received, the project team will receive the next 35% of their funding. In the final month of implementation period, teams will submit their final project report. And once the final report is received, teams will then receive the final 5% of funding allocated. Please note that the final 5% of funds will not arrive to your team treasurer's account until after the end of the implementation period. As mentioned, teams will be required to provide receipts as part of budget management and reporting on expenses at each report. This tiered disbursement and allotment ensure that each project is meeting the work plan that is outlined and agreed upon in their project proposal. It's important to note each of these items because as you are developing your project and application, you need to think through how each will be factored into your project management timeline and team responsibilities. Following the final report, the debriefing seminar will be held in October 2024. And at this seminar, project representatives will discuss their successes, challenges, learnings, and full project outcomes. As mentioned in previous webinars, programming and expenses, including visa fees needed to travel to New Zealand, will be covered by Cultural Vistas. For those interested applicants applying for the YPL Small Grants Program that are not currently living in the Pacific region, you'll be responsible for your travel to a country in the region from which Cultural Vistas will arrange travel to the kickoff workshop or debriefing seminar. As we conclude the presentation, I want to reiterate what I mentioned earlier. We will be working closely with all selected participants during the kickoff workshop and during the project implementation period to ensure that your budget meets and addresses project needs. The proposal budget should be focused on telling your project story through the items that you need to make it happen. You need to demonstrate how you plan to achieve the projects that you describe in your narrative description through the budget as well. The budget is a part of the project story that you are trying to tell and what you are trying to represent in your proposal. So don't forget that. Again, this is much of the how of how your project will happen and what will make it a success. Overall, during the review of applications, the review panel will be looking at whether project budgets align with the proposal project goals and objectives, as well as the project's impact. It's important to keep in mind while constructing your budget that 3 things that we look at in a project application are feasibility, sustainability, and scalability. Feasibility being, Can you complete the project in a given period? Sustainability, taking into consideration how can the project continue to impact the targeted community past the 6-month funding timeframe? And lastly, scalability, being how can the project continue to grow in size or impact after the YPL Small Grants Program? Now to the questions. I know that you may have a lot of questions on budgeting, so I'll start with common funding questions that we have received from other small grants programs and potential applicants, as well as any questions that we may have received to the inbox after the first few webinars for this application cycle. We share the answers to these frequently asked questions as they may answer questions that you did not even know that you had. So here are some common budget-related questions that we have received from past iterations of YPL Small Grants programs. The first is, what do I need to consider when making purchases for the grant? Project teams need to have due diligence when estimating costs, meaning that they can demonstrate that expenses are cost-effective, such as not just picking your favorite airline, but comparing costs and going with the most reasonable and average price for their expenses. One way to do this is to search multiple possibilities for quotes to give you an idea of the most cost-effective option. Another question is, can I request funding for an already established project? Or would it be allowed for our proposed project to use YPL funds to supplement an upcoming project that we are planning to implement during the YPL grant period? So again, cost sharing is allowed and highlights the sustainability of the project. If you're proposing a collaboration with an existing project, this project would need to still fulfill the requirements listed under the YPL grants program guidelines and would need to be within one of the 4 YPL pillars. In your project proposal application, you'll need to outline the work already completed on this project and emphasize how the YPL Small Grants 6 months of funding will further the work that you're doing with this project. Your application budget and proposal must demonstrate and showcase the specific ways that the small grants funds will be applied over the 6 months of the YPL small grants period. And they must also show that it's feasible within that 6-month implementation period. One example of a previous grant recipient that applied for a grant in relation to their current work is with an e-commerce platform. They applied for grant funding successfully to build up their mobile app and online presence for the existing organization to enhance their presence on social media and more widely. Another example from a project a few years back was for an established reading program where they used the funding to bring their program online and make it accessible during the COVID-19 pandemic and to reach more students during that time. Another common question that we are asked is, do you need to include other sources of funds if they get project sponsors outside of the YPL Small Grants Program? Again, yes, please include this amount in the sum of funds outlined in the total cost share line of the budget template. You do not need to include this in the specific line items and offer extensive detail. However, it is good to show that your project is sponsored or cost shared with other sources of funding. Can the funds for the program be used to implement stages of the plan after the 6 months? The funds that you request should set out to be fully used for the implementation period of the project within the 6 months. As the implementation occurs, selected teams need to ensure that the funds are used within the funding period for the YPL Small Grants Program. Again, this is important to consider as you're structuring your budget and your work plan so that you know that what you're planning to do is feasible within those 6 months. Another common question we get about budgeting is, do we need to provide documents or price quotations for the budget proposal? This is a no, but if you're trying to demonstrate the need for large equipment, you will need to provide a quote. Again, we recommend that if you are planning to include large equipment purchases for your budget, to please reach out to Cultural Vistas for confirmation that these items can be funded, but no other quotes or invoices are required for your proposal outside of that. Another common question is, can administrative fees be covered? Administrative fees would be considered under salary, office space, and overhead expenses within the budget category, and therefore are not fundable under the YPL Small Grants Program. Again, there are ways that you can compensate any outside contractors that you're working with in terms of personnel, such as an honorarium or speaking fee for a professional that is assisting your project. This is not considered a salary and is fundable, but cannot exceed $250 per speaker. Another common question that we often receive is, rather than using the project treasurer's bank account, would it be okay for us to open a bank account specifically for the project? Yes, it is acceptable to create a bank account specifically for the project, and if selected to participate in the YPL Small Grants Program, you'll need to provide those bank details to Cultural Vistas. Whatever account you choose to use, it's important to note that that account needs to be able to accept funds sent from the United States. Another common question connected to cost share that we often receive is, should we include in-kind donations? In-kind meaning in terms of utilizing our resources such as ink for a printer, paper, resources, tools, etc. And the answer to this is that you do not need to list out each item for your in-kind donation. Again, that does not need to be included in the line items for your budget. However, if you have an estimate of what this in-kind cost share may total to, you should include that in your budget under the total cost share line to show that you have that support. What about stipends for participants of our workshops? If you plan to host any kind of project related to a workshop, you can include stipends or per diem for participants to attend. This is normally for participants to have their meals, if not already included in the programming that you set out to provide. You may categorize something like this under travel or the other category. And generally, how we calculate this is by day and using a researched estimate of the cost of meals in that country or city. Having a flat rate, however, for all participants across the board is important, and it's important to include the breakdown of the amount per person within your budget. Now we'll move on to any questions from those in attendance that you may have. And for those that have questions that may come up after the conclusion of the webinar today, as you are viewing the recording, feel free to email them to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we'll be sure to address them as soon as possible.